Greetings, this is Dr. Tshepo Moloi, and we are proceeding from our first lecture where we spoke about philosophy and the discipline of philosophy. So, because we began with the general and broader definition of philosophy, we want to now advance and proceed into the realm of what is referred to as African philosophy. And, with me at books on African philosophy, this one came out in 1998, edited by Eze, Emmanuel Chukwudu Eze. And because I'm in South Africa, we cannot not talk about philosophy from Africa, which was edited by P.H. Kutsia and A.P.J. Roux. These two texts are a nice introduction to African philosophy. But in terms of historically, one wants to think about the first book that would open the doors and lead the way in terms of sparking debate about an African philosophy. So, just as a premise, we need to agree that if philosophy is a discipline about thought, philosophy really has different strands and trends, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the first book that really opened, the vista of debate on African philosophy was from a priest called John Mbiti. Now, I say first book, but really it's part of the pioneering set of groups of books that would come out. This book came out in 1969, and John Mbiti was basically a professor of religious studies at Makerere University in Uganda and director for the Ecumenical Institute in Bosse, Switzerland. And he's important because as a reverend, the discipline of philosophy is always interlinked with the discipline of theology. And so religion being really what theology is studying or is focused on as a study, as a field of study. He is, as the title gives us, African religions in philosophy. So what John Mbiti does, and here I just run down looking at his contents page, he really takes us through what firstly, I think he first visits for the reader what early Western approaches and attitudes of philosophy are, and then he gives us the concept of time as a key to understanding and interpretation of African religions and philosophy. And then he talks about the nature of God, and then he speaks about the works of God, God and nature, the worship of God, and birth and childhood, initiation and puberty rites, marriage and procreation, specialists, medicine men, rainmakers, kings and priests, the concepts of evil, ethics and justice, Christianity, Islam, and other religions, and the search for new values, identity, and security. So I'm giving you a sense because I don't want to confuse and go into details on what Reverend John Mbiti, gave us in the seminal text on African religions. But one wants to set the tone for the different trends and the different strands that make up African philosophy. And it's a debate. There is no one definition of African philosophy. But what is important, and I'm going to pick here from the preface of this book readings, Philosophy from Africa, which is a contested topic because to give a book, Philosophy from Africa, because then that already indicates or suggests that there is a particular form of philosophy linked to a particular geography. But in this strand, however, of African philosophy, we are told in this book that there are 7 categories that we may consider. And the first category is culture, the philosophy of culture. Of course, here, in this particular context, it is African culture. The second, and here we are told of trends. And in these trends, we're given ethno-philosophy, sage philosophy, ideological philosophy, and professional philosophy. Now, ethno-philosophy has got its particular scholars to do with really, the practice of ethics, different cultures, how they distinguish different cultures across Africa. Sage philosophy, really the elders, the wisdom of the elders within the African continent. Ideological philosophy really speaks for itself, the field of ideas and how that influences this discourse on philosophy. And professional philosophy is really, regardless of the geography here, it's the trained philosophers in the discourse of philosophy at a scholarly level. So they would have done a course in philosophy, a module in philosophy, a degree, master's, all the way to PhD in philosophy. And those individuals would be referred to as professional philosophers. And then, so those are the trends. These trends are important because they make the core of what is under African philosophy, the rubric of African philosophy. Then we move on to metaphysics. Here in brackets, you can put idealism. So the metaphysical. So what we can't touch, but what we can only imagine, think, feel, not feel. Then there's epistemology, which is the sociology of knowledge. Then we move to ethics, which is in brackets communitarianism, right? The field of ethics. Then we move to politics, which is political philosophy. Liberation ideologies and struggles within the African philosophy context. Then there's aesthetics, the status of African art as art. And religion is a big part of this, the different rituals that African people perform and the like. All of this is regarded as part of aesthetics. So we're told and we're guided by these categories on African philosophy to give us at least some form of radar, some form of guideline to follow when we participate in the discourse debates on African philosophy. Now, in this book, Dieda Kapagawani, in talking to the topic of what is African philosophy, really tells us that the question of African philosophy is really a question about why Western philosophers, or so-called professional philosophers, have reacted, and why have they reacted to what has been coined as African philosophy. So he tells us in the discourse that it's really a practice that has decades now of existence, and it has existed for basically 2 reasons. Firstly, the attempt to falsify certain anthropological thesis, and then secondly, it has been the political factor, to basically go into that domain of decolonization, of the mind, and here the colonized mind, because Africa and African people have been colonized by the Westerners. So Western philosophers here are not immune to this criticism. And here we have Wiredu um, advancing this argument that Dieda Kapagawane invokes, and he also invokes other African philosophers, Pauline Hotonji from Ethiopia, Oruka from Nigeria, and other African philosophers in this light. But of course, I was interested in the different, approaches in African philosophy, such as ethnophilosophy. The term is an etymological, um, it's an etymological reference really to Francophone African philosophers. And here, of course, we think um, at the height of this will be your Placide Tempels, your John Mbitis, and Alexis Kagame. Their works, alongside anthropologists, really talks to this field of ethnophilosophy. And when you move to the next category of philosophic sagacity, here really it's an holistic approach, and this approach really talks to almost being the logical opposite to that of ethnophilosophy. And for me, I feel that it will forever be a field of debate, particularly because what we regard in Africa as the elders, as ancestral knowledge, is contested by the West as nothing else, but cultural relativism, and this for me is problematic, but it forms part of the huge debate as part of philosophic sagacity. Then there's nationalistic ideological philosophy. And here, because I'm in South Africa, one may think here about people like Steve Biko and their black consciousness in the form of the black philosophers, South African philosophers. But we touch on that in the next episode when we talk about South African philosophers, black South African philosophers. And then the next category is professional philosophy. And here the definition and conception is given to us as the philosophy done by African philosophers, whether it be in the area of logic, metaphysics, ethics, or history of philosophy. It is desirable that their works be set in some African context, but it is not necessarily that they be so. And this is by Bodundren. So what one may say in conclusion, according to Kapagawane, is that people such as Wiredu and have addressed the question of what is African philosophy should not be considered as requiring an immediate answer, however, by scholars who come to have attempts on African philosophy. African philosophy is all philosophers in Africa admit, still in the process of becoming. Of course, here I'm reminded of Eskia Mpatlela in his ideology of African humanism, where he tells us about the process of becoming, and has yet to give birth to philosophic traditions from which definitions can be formulated as to what in each particular tradition constitutes African philosophy. This would obviously depend on the basic principles underpinning the various philosophic research programs. Needless to say, since even Western philosophers define philosophy in different ways, there is no reason why African philosophers should all define African philosophy in the same way. So much then for the question of African philosophy. So this is a very overview of a summary of African philosophy. But I think if we are alive to the fact that a lot of these philosophers who've been practicing and are included and are evoked whenever we speak about African philosophy, if we're alive to the fact that these become really the voices that have made now the discourse of African philosophy, this overview of a background especially also when we remember that philosophy has two strands. It's got the philosophy of science and the philosophy of social sciences. It gives us a nice foundation for us to zero in on really my interest, which is South African philosophy or South African philosophers or philosophy in South Africa or coming from South Africa. So, this background, therefore, is good to have in mind as we build in the next lecture into detailing about the practice of of philosophy in the context of South Africa. Namaste. Thank you very much.